My deranged uncle had recently passed away. He was a hermit. None of my family really got to see him much, and he was an avid UFOlogist. Not only did he publish much information about the subject, but he also considered himself an investigator. His passing was not much of a surprise. He really didn't take care of his body that well, and he often drank and smoked. However, his cause of death was rather surprising. It appeared that someone had murdered him in his sleep. Whoever it was clearly a crime of passion. My uncle had received many stabbing and slashing wounds across his neck and torso. The police, unfortunately, didn't have any prospective suspects. He was never married, didn't owe anyone any money, and was generally liked in the UFOlogy community. Despite the gruesome form of murder, probably the most surprising thing about all of this was the fact that he left me his entire estate and all of his personal belongings. At first, my family was rather upset about this. It didn't seem fair to them that I had received everything of this uncle. Over the next couple of weeks, my family's outrage was ultimately suppressed after I gave them the option to look through his estate and his belongings to allow them to pick anything they wanted. After taking me up on this offer, they saw that his estate was practically in shambles, and all of his belongings were in a similar state. My uncle hardly left me any money, so there was no argument about that. The police were also interested in some of his belongings, not for them to keep obviously, but for them to use in their investigation. They essentially had no idea what had happened. They were also hoping that maybe there were some clues strewn about some of his stuff. I gave the police first pick on the stuff that they wanted. I wasn't able to get a look at any of it, but I could obviously tell that it was mostly his UFOlogy stuff. Stuff I wasn't necessarily interested in anyways. At this time, I was currently living in an apartment. I had about 4 months until my lease was up. I figured in order to save money, I could move into my uncle's estate, but in the meantime, while waiting on my lease to finish, I could just simply Airbnb it to other people, make a little bit of an additional income. Unfortunately, when I tried to list it, most people recognized it as the house that the old man was murdered in, and no one wanted to rent there. Then again, I don't really blame them. During that time while it was empty and no one was renting, I decided to go through his stuff and see what he was looking at. Most of his findings were still in custody of the police. However, I was able to find out that my uncle was a huge conspiracy theorist. It looked like from some of his material that he had laying around that aliens were among us and that there were different types of them. I could tell from different handwritten reports, assumingly by him, that he had first-hand experience of aliens entering his home. He also had reports of how fluoride in the water was keeping us from learning more, and also that the interior of the Earth was hollow. Obviously, I didn't pay much attention to any of this. As I was searching through his estate and through some of his papers, I found something really odd. I found a very large skeleton key that seemed to go to nowhere. I was going to throw it away, but the key looked so cool, I decided to keep it. I placed the cool-looking key in a junk drawer, and I forgot all about it. I remember one day I was going through some stuff at his estate. I was on the main floor doing some cleaning, when I heard some weird sounds coming from the basement below. I had been to his estate a couple times. The police were still investigating the case with my uncle, so they had the basement taped off. I had yet to have gone down there ever since. There was no secondary access to the basement. The basement door was the only way to get down there, and it was taped off from up top. However, there was something or someone down in the basement, and I needed to know. I walked over to the basement doorway and looked down. The basement door was left open, but it was taped off with yellow police tape. I gently removed some of the yellow police tape and slowly made my way down into the basement. As I was descending, I smelled what smelled like something burning, which obviously made me concerned. When I got to the bottom of the basement, I turned the lights on and took a look around. The basement was lined with all these boxes. They were all labeled with different titles and stacked certain ways that I assumed had correlation with one another. In the center of the basement appeared to be one of the stacks that had fallen over. Next to the stack of paper was something unusual, something I'd never seen before, and honestly, it was quite mesmerizing. There was some kind of black stone that had a slightly blue glow to it, laying in the middle of the floor. This stone was roughly the size of a small plum, and upon picking it up, I felt that it was slightly warm as well. I heard some rustling somewhere off in the basement behind some boxes. I decided to pick up the stone and pocket it inside my jean pocket, and I went upstairs. I finally did what I should have originally done to begin with. I called the police. I called them and I told them that I'm pretty sure that there was someone in my uncle's basement. Considering that he was murdered recently, and it was still an ongoing case, the police arrived in record time, during all of which I waited outside in my car. The police arrived and did a quick search of the house. They checked the basement and found nothing down there. However, they did find a broken window in the kitchen. What was odd about this was that the glass was outside, thus meaning that whoever broke out this window broke out from the inside. This was obviously too much for me, so I decided to call it a day. I thanked the police for coming by and investigating, and they took some more notes. They were still there when I left, and I assumed they continued their investigation. I went to my apartment and I called it a night. Instead of cooking a dinner for myself, I decided to order out and have someone deliver it to me. I got sushi, which is one of my favorite foods, and I watched a television series. When it was time for bed, I took my clothes off and I threw them in the corner. I could hear a slight thud coming from what I just threw. I took a double take and I looked over at my clothes. I then remembered I had that rock in my pocket, so I fished it out of my jean pocket. The rock was still illuminating a slightly blue glow, which I thought was really cool. I set it on my nightstand next to my phone, and I went to bed. I then dreamt the most wild dream I'd ever had. I don't know if it was because I was around my uncle's stuff too much, or maybe I glanced at some of his work, but I dreamt of aliens. I dreamt of your typical alien, which had the green skin with the large black eyes. I dreamt that they were at the foot of my bed, and they all watched me sleep, which would typically be something I'd find concerning. However, I wasn't afraid. I eventually woke up from that odd dream, and I checked my phone. To my surprise, I got an email from a couple that were a part of the UFOlogy community and wanted to stay in my uncle's house. I wasn't exactly sure if they knew my uncle, or if they knew what had happened in that house, so I made sure to inform them what had happened. Apparently my uncle had written some books at some point in his life. These people happened to be huge fans, and they wanted to stay a week in his house in order to get closer to him. I told them the weekly rate for the Airbnb, and they quickly accepted. I was shocked. After all these months of trying to get people to stay, I finally got a couple that wanted to. I went over to my uncle's house that day, and I cleaned up some stuff. I also brought my pistol with me, and I inspected the basement once again, just to make sure. I didn't find anything out of the ordinary in the basement. However, I didn't want to take any chances, so I decided to deadbolt the basement door. That way, if this couple tried to go in the basement, they wouldn't be able to. Before I locked the basement door, I made sure to put all of his valuables down into the basement. I didn't want this couple stealing anything from him. As I was cleaning up in my uncle's house, I opened the junk drawer, and then again I saw that old skeleton key sitting there. I figured that this was something probably important, so I decided to take that with me. As I was leaving the house, I got a call from the police station. They said that they were done with the investigation, or at least that they wanted to release his personal property back to us. I told them to bring it to my apartment rather than his old house. They did so, and it happened to be just more boxes of just more conspiracy stuff. Around that same time, I got a call from the couple wanting to stay in the Airbnb. I then went over to my uncle's place to let the couple in. I gave the couple the keys and told them that hopefully they had a wonderful stay. The couple looked really odd, even though they seemed really excited to stay here. But then again, who am I to judge? For some reason, I don't know why, I felt the urge to tell them about what had happened in the basement only a couple of days earlier. I didn't want to scare them away, and I didn't want to give them a reason for them to ask for a discount, so I decided not to tell them. They paid in cash and they paid up front for the whole week. I was really surprised. I went back to my apartment and I went inside. Upon entering, I saw all the boxes that the police had dropped off earlier that day. Seeing that I had nothing better to do, I went through all the other stuff to see why the police were so interested in it. After a few seconds of looking, I could see why. Most of the stuff that the police were looking at covered of demons and aliens from other dimensions, portals that connected us from those dimensions to ours. Obviously, most of it was nonsensical, but it was rather entertaining. I then came across something rather disturbing. It was a stack of calendars that all said the same thing for each day. Don't forget to feed Adam. Who was Adam? I thought. Maybe my uncle had a pet I didn't know about. I tried to look through some of the boxes to get an answer as to who Adam was, but I couldn't get any. It just struck me so odd that the police were interested in any of this. Then again, his murder was a complete mystery, and they were looking for any kind of leads they could find. After hours of searching through the boxes, it was already nighttime. I had to get up early the next morning for a work thing. I took a hot shower, took some melatonin, and I went to bed. That night, my dreams were significantly worse. I had severe sleep paralysis. I laid on my bed completely motionless, as I couldn't move. There was some kind of entity standing in the dark corner of my room. It slowly crawled over to me, and I could better see what was stalking me. It was some kind of creature, a creature that walked on all fours. Its skin was red and pinkish, as if it was skinned alive, and all you could see was the meat below. The shape of the creature was slightly human, with a somewhat normal body and head, but its eyes and mouth were completely deranged. Its eyes were completely dark, and its mouth were full of razor-sharp teeth. The creature didn't have a nose or ears. The creature crawled onto my bed, and then onto me. I could see it was about to eat me alive when it glanced over to my nightstand. It saw the rock that slightly glowed blue and completely ignored me. It then walked over to the nightstand, picked up the rock, and then what I can only describe as teleported out of the room. I woke up immediately in a cold sweat. It was 4 a.m. and I was completely exhausted. It felt like whatever I just went through had completely drained my energy. I went and glanced over at my phone and saw that the blue glowing rock was no longer next to it. It happened to be on the floor. I picked up the rock and I placed it next to my phone. I then looked at my phone and saw that I had about 13 messages, all of which happened to come from the couple staying in the Airbnb. I was so tired that I figured that the messages could wait till the morning. I woke up 2 hours later to my alarm blaring. I was still pretty tired, but I got some rest. I then got ready and went to work, went to that meeting, and I checked my phone. I then remembered from the night before that that couple had messaged me a bunch. I should probably respond. I opened the first message, and it was really odd. They asked me if I was expecting anyone to come to the Airbnb. That's a really weird thing to text. The message was sent around 11:30. I would have been in bed by then. I then read the rest of the messages, which progressively got worse. Why is there someone outside? The next text read. Instead of reading the rest of the texts, I then decided to call the couple. No response. Since I was somewhat close to my uncle's house, I figured it would be just as easy to drive by and knock on the door than anything. I drove by the house and saw that their car was still parked in the driveway. I got out of mine and I walked up to the front door and I knocked. No response. I then tried calling again on the cell phone, but still, no response. I then debated on calling the police, but what were they going to do? They were legally allowed to stay in my place since they were renting it. What would I tell them? That they just weren't answering my phone calls? I decided to make a decision that I'm glad I did. I called the police. The police arrived once again rather quickly. I told them the situation and what had happened. I showed them my texts and my phone calls. They seemed disturbed. Despite everything that had happened, I didn't tell them about my dream. I didn't tell them about the rock, and I didn't tell them about the creature. I figured that they'd think that I was crazy. After knocking a couple of times on the door, the police then resorted to kicking in the door. Perhaps out of morbid curiosity, I followed the police inside the home. Surprisingly enough, no one stopped me. As I followed the police inside, I was instantly hit with an incredible stench. A smell that I will probably never forget. One of the first smells I recognized was the burning smell that I smelled in the basement earlier. I then began to smell something that I couldn't recognize. The closest thing that I could describe it as would be rotting meat. It also had a mixture of something tangy. I can't really describe it. The police did a quick search of the house, and I slowly followed behind them. I was afraid as to what I was going to find, and sure enough, I was right. When we finally reached the master bedroom, they opened the door to find the couple in the bed. They both had been eviscerated. Both their torsos had been torn open, and their internal organs been strewn about. Blood had covered the bed and the nearby walls. I immediately left the room and went outside to the other policemen. Due to the circumstances, as well as everything that had happened, I was suspect number 1. I then soon found out that the couple that had been murdered had died the same way as my uncle. I'm not sure if the dreams that I'd been having all week had anything to do with the murders. I'm not completely sure if that slightly blue glowing rock had actually saved me. All I do know, the creature that I saw in my quote-unquote dream was definitely more incapable to do to me than what had happened in those murders. I was investigated briefly by the police. After a couple of hours of holding me down in the station, they let me go based on the fact that they actually didn't have any hard evidence to keep me. I was now more determined to figure out what had happened to my uncle, since I am now the prime suspect for another murder case. I immediately left the station and went back to my apartment. I looked through all the boxes that the police had left there. I somehow knew that whatever had happened to those people and my uncle had something to do with my dreams, and I figured that those boxes would be able to tell me what was going on. After going through the boxes for a few hours, I finally came across something that was remotely credible. It appeared to be a map with a bunch of notes drawn in the side columns. Along with the map, I saw some very graphic images drawn by my uncle that very much depicted the thing that I saw in my dream. At the bottom of one of the drawings was titled Adam. I then looked at the map and I was able to Google the coordinates. The coordinates led to some place out in the outskirts of town, seemingly out in the middle of nowhere. At this point it was starting to get dark. Instead of calling it a night, I decided that I needed answers. I took the map as well as the glow-glowing rock and that weird skeleton key I found, and I took off into the location. The coordinates didn't lead to a road. In fact, it required me to park my car off of one of the busy highways and hike about 3 miles. I took a flashlight as well as the other items I brought with me, and I started my hike off into the field. After about 45 minutes, the location led me to what appeared to be a random shack out in the middle of a field. It looked like those random shacks you see when you're on a long highway, like some kind of maintenance shack or something. I arrived at the shack and unfortunately, it was locked by this weird old-looking lock on the front of it. I then remembered my items. One of them was a skeleton key. Could it be possible that the two could go together? I pulled the key out of my pocket and I tried it. And sure enough, it worked. I slowly opened the small shack and I found a gruesome discovery. The dirt floor was primarily covered with what appeared to be human bones. I shined my flashlight around and saw that the walls were stained black and red. However, in the middle of the shack laid something more disturbing. There appeared to be some type of heavy chain system used to chain some kind of large animal. After a few minutes of glancing around, it finally dawned on me what had happened. It appeared that my uncle probably captured one of those things and chained it up out in the middle of nowhere. It looked like he was feeding humans to it. Hence what was scribbled on the calendars, "Feed Adam." I immediately called the police and told them what I found. They quickly met me out there about an hour later. They were suspicious of my reporting since I was previously a suspect in another murder case. This would be the evidence that they need that I was a murderer. However, that's not what concerns me. What concerns me is the fact that the police took all my items away when they took me into custody, including that blue rock. I fear as to what will happen when that creature visits me again in my dreams. I fear what it'll do to me if I don't have that rock. In 2007, I was in high school. During that time, my girlfriend of 5 months had just broken up with me. I was devastated, and I thought it was the end of the world, or at least mine. I finally decided the best way to take my mind off of things was for me to go camping. Originally, my friend group consists of 5 people. but for whatever the reason, all of them couldn't make it that weekend. I considered postponing my camping trip. I figured the worst thing for me to do is to be by myself, but then again, I really loved camping. The place I was going was rather nice. Most people would go there during the weekend, so technically I wouldn't be by myself, just with other strangers camping in the woods. Friday eventually came, which felt like forever. I packed up my old truck with my camping gear and took off for the camping grounds. I got there rather early, considering my Friday was a half day at school. I was able to pick out a campsite, set up my camp, and even have a small fire, all before 3 o'clock. Around 5 or 6 is when all the other campers started pulling in. Thankfully, most of the campsites are pretty far apart. However, a small young family was able to pitch their campsite next to mine. They had a dog and a few kids, but I really didn't mind. They were pretty quiet for the most part, and seemed to respect the boundaries of the campsites. They even kept their dog on the leash, which for camping is very considerate. One of the many nice things about camping that I really enjoy is the ability to get up and take a hike at any moment. Right around the time when the sun starts to set is my favorite time to go hiking. Naturally, I'll have to bring a flashlight since it'll get dark pretty quick once the sun sets. As I'm leaving my campsite and walking out into the woods, the family that put their campsite next to mine were able to intercept me and they introduced themselves. The father figure of the family was named Brian, and his wife was named Ashley. Their 2 kids were named Colton and Jeffrey. Their little dog that they had with them was named Lucky, which I thought was a really funny name for a dog. I introduced myself, and I'm very polite with them. They told me that unfortunately that their new dog that they just got, Lucky, still has issues going to bed at night. He might bark a few times, so they just gave me a heads up, that for which I was very grateful for. I told them not to worry about it, and it wasn't a big deal. It's pretty much one of the sounds of nature, if you ask me. They seemed very grateful that I was understanding. Anyways, I continued my hike out into the woods. I can see a few flashlights here and there throughout the woods. This roughly tells me that there are other people out hiking in the woods as well. When I like to hike, I try to go as deep into the woods as I can, especially now since I'm trying to get over a breakup. I wanted to forget my emotions, and hiking was the best way for that. The deeper I went into the woods, the less flashlights I saw. I don't think many people enjoyed the same type of hiking as I did, at least at night. About 30 minutes into my hike, I see something quite odd. Normally you'll see underage teens doing nefarious activities out in the woods at this type of hour. However, this wasn't the case. I could see not too far off the trail that there was a flashlight laying on the ground. Obviously, the only reason I saw it was because the flashlight was still on. Why was this thing over there? The first thing that popped into my mind was that there was someone out here that didn't want to be seen. Instead of turning off the flashlight, they decided to throw it off into the distance. After giving that a second thought, that really didn't make much sense. The next thing I thought of was perhaps that someone had an accident. Maybe they fell off the trail or something dragged them over there. Naturally, being the young and curious man that I was, I decided to go and investigate. I walked over to the area where the flashlight laid, and it was very much overgrown with twigs and brush. Not necessarily the most easiest way to access this location. I must have been distracted by the flashlight's light to notice, but there was a red trail leading from the trail over to the flashlight. Not a great sign. I saw that the red trail continued past the flashlight and off into the deeper woods. I decided not to investigate that much, and I decided to turn around. Seeing everything already made me feel uneasy. I was also beginning to feel an odd sense of dread, a sense that I'm not normally familiar with out in the woods. At this point, I was beginning to regret my long hike into the woods. When I got back on the trail and started hiking back, I could have sworn I heard something off in the distance. Naturally, I associated the sound with the thing that I saw. I assumed that whatever had happened was now going to happen to me. Instead of hiking back and taking in the sights, I decided that a light jog would be the best manner of getting back. I eventually made it back to the campsite. However, whatever was making those sounds out in the woods seemed to have followed me. Whenever I would shine my flashlight behind me, the sounds would stop. I went back to my campsite and called it a night. I didn't even have dinner or have a campfire, which was very much unlike me. I went to bed and that was that. However, I was awakened about 2 hours later to the dog next to my campsite, barking. At first I was upset since the dog had waken me up, but then I remembered the couple next to me, telling me that this was a new dog and that this was going to happen. I was no longer upset, but I was still kind of annoyed. However, my annoyance was slowly changing into concern. The dog was barking like crazy, but I couldn't hear anyone trying to comfort the dog or anything. Perhaps this was their technique on training their dog. Perhaps that, if they let the dog bark, that it'll tire itself out and eventually go to bed. But the most unusual thing about this was the fact that the dog was barking as if it was on fire. The dog was an absolute lunatic. With the dog barking in this manner, there is no way I was going to get any sleep this night. I was half tempted to go to the campsite next door and give them a piece of my mind, but then again I remembered how nice they were to me. They had 2 little kids as well, so they would probably need their sleep also. Instead of intervening, I decided just to take my sleeping bag and hike down to my truck and sleep there. I knew the way well enough, so I didn't need a flashlight. I could make the hike easily in the dark. As I was hiking down to my truck, I could see other campers with flashlights hiking up to my area. They were probably going to tell the people with the dog to shut it up or something. When I passed them on the trail, I said, "Good luck," as I went on my way. I threw the sleeping bag in the back of my truck, which wasn't terribly comfortable. However, the sound down here was much more reasonable. About 10 minutes of being at my truck, I started to hear screaming and yelling coming from the campsite where I once was. Great. Now it's a huge confrontation. However, the screaming seemed to be one-sided. I felt bad for the family and for their dog since I knew it was kind of out of their control. But then again, there were other people here, so I don't know what you're supposed to do. Things took a turn for the worst when I could hear sirens off in the distance, getting closer and getting louder. Great. Someone called the police on them. How original. However, to my surprise, the sirens didn't belong to a police car. It was an ambulance. I was very surprised to see this and was very concerned. 3 or 4 other police cars finally arrived, and they started taping off the area. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get much more information. The police had sent everyone at the campsite home, which I thought was unfair. I still had my camp set up back up at the top. Anyways, I didn't really argue with them, so I just went home. So much for a camping trip, I thought. It wasn't until the next day, when the evening news aired, that I finally got some answers. Apparently, the campsite that I was at was the subject for multiple disappearances. Much like the news today, that evening news didn't really share much valid information. However, since I was there the night prior, I had some idea as to what had happened. I can't say definitely that I know what had happened to the couple and their family next to me. However, I do have some ideas, and unfortunately, it doesn't look good.